Welcome. This is in the last in a series of our webinars. This is the Delaware River Basin Commission Draft Fracking Regulations webinar focusing on wastewater import. We've been holding a series of webinars, Berks Gas Truth and Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and tonight joined by Catskill Mountainkeeper and the Partnership for Policy Integrity over the last month in order to help people get ready for the hearings that are coming up and prepare written comments to the record of the Delaware River Basin Commission. This series of webinars is dedicated to how to support a complete ban on fracking and its activities, including frack wastewater, throughout the Delaware River watershed. This is the last in our series, but the recordings will be available for all webinars on the Delaware Riverkeeper Network website and the websites of these other organizations. Just look on the calendar page for that webinar and you'll find them. We're also distributing talking points to accompany the webinars, and those will also be available. Tonight's webinar has facts and information regarding wastewater added to the documents that we have already distributed. So whether or not fracking is completely banned in the Delaware River watershed is going to be decided in the coming months by the Delaware River Basin Commission. As you know, this decision is truly going to define our lives and our future. So quickly, we've gone through this in the beginning of each webinar, but I think it is important for us to just check in and say, what is the DRBC doing? Well, the Delaware River Basin Commission has a de facto fracking moratorium in place. It's been in place since 2010. It's under attack by industry. The governors of the 4 states whose streams flow to the Delaware, that is Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, will be deciding whether to completely ban it or to set regulations that would allow some of fracking's related activities. As you all know, there are 5 voting members of the Delaware River Basin Commission, the governors of the 4 states and the Army Corps of Engineers representing the federal government or President Trump. What's the next step? Well, the DRBC posted draft regulations on November 30th, and they were put out for public comment. Public comment period has been open since then. The proposed ban is on high-volume hydraulic fracturing throughout the Delaware River Basin. We looked at that at our first webinar. But the DRBC also issued draft regulations that allow the export of water from the watershed for fracking. We looked at that last week. And the storage, processing, and discharge of frack wastewater within the basin. We argued for big changes, by the way, in the public participation process because we know that that process is set up in a very unjust way. Very limited opportunities for people to give input into this really important, historic decision that the DRBC is going to be making. But after a lot of public onslaught, the DRBC did extend the public comment period, so it's now no longer February 28th, it's March 30th. And they did add 2 verbal testimony opportunities. Next week, of course, are the public hearings that have been scheduled since the beginning, and that's January 23rd and 25th. That's Waymart and Philadelphia. And then February 22nd was added in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and a telephone session for March 6th. All the details on all of that is at that Facebook link. And also, remember, 5 p.m. March 30th is the end of written comments. We want to load that record up with comments about why we must have a ban and why we cannot accept these nonsensical proposals to allow wastewater to be dumped here and fresh water to be taken out. Well, what do we know? We know drilling and fracking can't be done safely, no matter how well they so-called regulate it. We know the weight of evidence shows that fracking and its related activities pollute, and they gravely harm human health and the environment forever. We know the public opposes fracking, and we know that we don't need shale gas to meet our energy needs. As a matter of fact, natural gas is contributing and ruining climate. To achieve a complete and permanent ban, we need to make the case on the record, though, why we must have this. That's why the comments are so important. So just to give a little geographic context to this, because it is important, the Delaware River watershed is about 13,000 square miles. It's 330 miles long. East and west branches of the Delaware join in Hancock, and then they flow down. They go along New York and Pennsylvania, past New Jersey, and past Delaware, into the Bay, and to the Atlantic Ocean. The Delaware is a national wild and scenic river. It's also a national estuary. It is the largest free-flowing river east of the Mississippi, and 17 million people drink Delaware River water. And that includes people in New York City and Philadelphia. Delaware River Basin Commission Special Protection Waters regulations prohibit the degradation of the water quality of those sections of the river. That's why we know that fracking cannot be done here, because it would violate that provision to require that the exceptional water quality of the river be maintained. Now, here is a map that shows you where the high volume hydraulic fracturing in what they call the hydrocarbon-bearing formations is located in the Delaware River watershed. Now, that pretty much includes the Marcellus and the Utica shales when you talk about high volume, because they define it as 300,000 gallons of water during all stages of well drilling. And that's the tan area here that you see, the Marcellus, and also dipping into New Jersey as well, the Utica. So there are other formations in the Delaware River watershed. They're not presently being mined or extracted, but the South Newark Basin extends northwesterly from Bucks and Montgomery counties in Pennsylvania across the Delaware River and into north-central New Jersey, all the way out to the coastal waters. And that, too, has gas-bearing formation according to the U.S. Geologic Survey, and there actually has been some exploratory wells done there. I would like to mention that during our slideshow here, we will be taking questions and answers in the chat box. So those of you who have participated before, I see, are already making some comments in that chat box. If you have questions as we go along, put them in the chat box, because we're going to be going at the very end to try to answer your questions. So as you think of them, pop them in there, and then at the end, all three of us will be able to discuss this with you. So moving forward, we're going to take a look at what hydraulic fracturing is. Of course, everyone pretty much knows. You get the water, you mix chemical and proppants with it, you inject it under high pressure down a well bore that is extended horizontally into the deep formations. Natural gas flows back after the fissures from this high pressure, little mini earthquakes you might call it, bursts open fractures in that deep formation, and up the wellbore comes the natural gas and the flowback fluids that we'll be spending so much time discussing here tonight. And then those produced waters are flowback waters, which together can be called wastewater, under the Clean Water Act, has to be disposed of under certain regulations. So before I go into discussing exactly what the regulations say, I would like to say that tonight we have special guests. Karen Ferridan was not able to be on tonight, and she, of course, has been a presenter throughout this series. Tonight we have Wes Gillingham. He's the Associate Director of Catskill Mountainkeeper, and we also have Dusty Horwitz, who's Senior Counsel for the Partnership for Policy Integrity. And both of these presenters tonight will be discussing specific issues entailed in wastewater, and you'll be able to ask them questions about the slides that they'll be covering. So let's take a look at actually what the draft regulations say about fracking wastewater. So broadly, they say that the importation of wastewater into the basin is discouraged. Well, you might say, what do they mean by that? Well, these are a couple of the points that they require that an applicant answer. In order to be able to do that, it is stricter than simply discharging wastewater from a process that's within the basin. The frack wastewater requires the DRBC to look at it, review it, and get an approval. And they have to show that they are going to be treating this or discharging it from a new or existing wastewater treatment facility approved by a permit from the Delaware River Basin Commission. If it is approved by a state permit, it has to meet an administrative agreement between the DRBC and the state. There is a requirement that alternatives be examined, and one of the alternatives has to be no import or no project. Also, they have to look at the water resource benefits and impairments. They have to look at the economic and social impacts of the project, and they have to say what those are. And then they also, all discharges have to comply with the DRBC water quality rules. Those are all online at the Delaware River Basin Commission, and we have several points in the text of talking points that point you to different places in the water quality regulations and the water code where you can understand further what those rules are. They also have to comply with federal and state regulations, but if the DRBC and federal and state regulations are not the same, the more stringent requirement applies. So, what else do they say about fracking wastewater? Well, this is a little dense, and I'm going to try to go through it as quickly as I can. It's a little technical, but treatability studies are required. Well, a treatability study looks at these points that are on this slide, and it says that each source of what they call a centralized waste treatment facility produced wastewater has to be identified. So you have to say where each of these wells are, and then you have to do a study of how to treat the waste, and the study has to be based on these bullet points. All pollutants of concern have to be analyzed, characterized, and quantified. What's a pollutant of concern? Well, it basically are radioactive, toxic, or other substances in produced water that have long life or persistence. And the ones that the DRBC are going to be including in the treatability studies are listed in the EPA tables in their report, which accompanies their guidelines for oil and gas extraction for that point source category. The EPA tables are listed there, and you can find under June 2016 EPA oil and gas point source category online that entire document, and the pollutants of concern list are there. Also, a whole effluent toxicity test has to be done to measure the acute and chronic toxicity. What is that? Well, basically, the whole effluent toxicity test, or WET test, measures the whole or the cumulative or the aggregate toxic effect to aquatic organisms from all of the pollutants that are contained in the facility's wastewater, or what they call effluent. That's the wastewater. Treatment technologies and design criteria have to be identified by the applicant, how they're going to do it. The wastewater can't pass through or interfere with the facility's process. When they say pass through, that means go through the process without being changed. And the effluent has to meet required limits set by the DRBC. The residuals classification, that is the stuff that's left after you filter the wastewater through, those solids, that classification, how it's classified by the state, that says how it can be disposed of. The treatment of those residuals and the disposal can't be affected by the pollutants that are going through it. In other words, it can't be changed by one of these pollutants. The discharge can't contribute to an exceedance of water quality standards. That means it can't violate water quality standards or stream quality objectives, or it can impair existing or protected uses. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this. What else do DRBC's draft regulations say? Well, they have some additional effluent requirements. One of them is for total dissolved solids. Now, total dissolved solids are basically the combined content of inorganic salts. And that's things such as calcium, chloride, sulfates, there's a whole list of them, and some organic matter dissolved in water. And total dissolved solids are not to exceed the background, that's what's already in the stream or waterway, or 500 milligrams per liter, whichever is less. We're going to talk a lot more about that. Zones 4 through 6, which is roughly South Philadelphia, south to the Delaware Bay to the ocean, all the way through basically the estuary, are not to exceed 1,000 milligrams per liter, or a concentration that's established by the DRBC. And we're going to talk a lot more about that too. How to determine your background concentrations has been published. It's in the regulations, but they haven't figured out, or they say they're still developing their analytical methods. So they're not published yet. For waters designated as drinking water, and that's basically down again to Zone 4, which is South Philadelphia south, the effluent, or the wastewater, shall not exceed the more stringent of the EPA or the host state's primary drinking water standards for inorganic chemicals, organic chemicals, disinfection byproducts, and for secondary drinking water standards. For the whole effluent toxicity, the effluent or the wastewater shall not exceed 0.3 toxic units for acute and 1 toxic units for chronic. Basically, that's nothing special. That's fairly standard. It's nothing particularly strict. So finally, what else do the regulations say? Well, let's look a little closer at the pollutants of concern. For special protection waters, the effluent cannot exceed background concentration of each pollutant in the receiving water. And that's because the water quality can't be degraded in that section. And you have exceptional water quality there. For all other waters, the pollutant must meet the water quality criteria or not exceed background concentration of the pollutant. An example of water quality criteria, you might ask, well, that's something like for arsenic, it's 10 parts per billion on the federal standard. For New Jersey, it's 5 parts per billion. That's a water quality criteria. Monitoring and reporting may be required, according to them, to ensure compliance with numeric limits. It's not necessarily required. And also to be used to support development of new numeric limits, they say in their proposal. And the point of compliance, that means the place where the water quality criteria must be met, and that's where the treated wastewater or the effluent basically hits the receiving water. The point of compliance is the point of discharge. Okay, so the point of compliance where you have to meet that standard is where the water hits where the effluent hits the water. But a mixing zone, or a zone that allows the contaminant to pollute the stream until you measure it at a specific location downstream, is allowed in certain places. Basically, it's the estuary. So, the devil is in the details here, and we're going to now go down into this a little bit more. Where are the holes here? This sounds pretty strict. What does it mean? Well, whole effluent toxicity, wet testing, should only be the first stage in a risk assessment. Wet testing identifies the hazard. It doesn't identify how much risk is associated with that hazard. Wet testing to assess the effect of all the pollutants in a facility's effluent is not conclusive, and there are scientific papers that explain this. And we give them in the talking points and links to those to one particular paper which explains it very well. Pollutants of concern. The pollutants listed in the EPA tables that DRBC is going to be using, says they're going to use, don't cover all those in frack wastewater. Just as an example, the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, in their study that they did on hydraulic fracturing, listed 154 of these constituents, and that's twice as many as the parameters that are listed on the EPA tables. And their list came from actually testing the wastewater from the Marcellus. Also, as an example, there are more than 1,000 constituents in frac fluids today. DRBC themselves say that in the supplemental material that accompany the draft regulations. And many of them are in the waste stream because the frac fluids carry through to the wastewater. And many of them are also unknown, and we'll hear more about that from Dusty Horwitz and from Wes Gillingham. Now, not exceeding the background concentration, that might not cause harm if there's a very low or no concentration of a pollutant, but waterways with higher pollutant levels, they're going to be doomed to maintain a degraded condition if you allow the discharger to go right up to that background concentration. And DRBC says they're still developing the analytical methods and the method detection limits and also the quantification limits of how you do these background concentrations. So there's no reliability at this point. And we just can't rely on what they're saying and that down the road they're going to fix it and make sure it's strong enough. So in the estuary, we have a problem with TDS. And the biggest by mass pollutant in frac wastewater, just by sheer volume, is total dissolved solids. And so we know 500 milligrams per liter is not good enough for waters that do not have total dissolved solids as a problem. And certainly the 1,000 milligrams per liter that they're proposing for the estuary is not protective either. We have some studies on the talking points that show that aquatic life need a greater protection than 500 milligrams per liter. As a matter of fact, striped bass, when they're spawning, suffer at 350. So the DRBC's 500 milligrams per liter certainly isn't good enough, and definitely the 100 milligrams per liter can actually spell death to some species. And that's for zones 4 to 6, again, that's South Philadelphia, all the way through the estuary and the bay and down to the ocean. Also, those areas allow mixing zones. And because the estuary drinking water is not a protected use, the safe drinking water standards that we heard about on the earlier slide that they're saying they're going to meet, they don't apply. So less strict pollution controls are in that whole area. And since the DRBC allows mixing zones there, which, as I said earlier, that means pollution in the wastewater that doesn't meet the clean water standards can be mixed or diluted by the waterway before meeting a required standard, you're really threatening the life that lives in that waterway. It threatens the life in all of the zones of the estuary and the bay. And since the tides carry pollutants, including increased salinity, such as from TDS, as well as pollutants and toxics upstream with the tides and into the tributaries, areas that do provide drinking water, including the state of Delaware's tributary drinking water intakes, like Christiana River, and also the Philadelphia intake, 1.5 million people drink that water, and South Jersey's drinking water intake, serving millions of people, and the upstream river zones are all going to be impacted by these higher concentrations downstream in the estuary. So they're all tidally influenced and they're all going to be negatively impacted. This is no way to protect the Delaware River. It's not going to work. Also, allowing DRBC to set a TDS concentration, as they say a little bit earlier on that slide, you saw a concentration established by the Commission that is compatible with designated water uses. Well, this is not reliable, and it's not protective. DRBC currently grants variances, for instance, for TDS loadings from wastewater into these areas right now, into the estuary right now. DRBC even has a form that a discharger can fill out to explain why they can't meet the TDS limits and why they need a mixing zone. It's that standard of practice. Examples of specific approvals for permits where DRBC has been lax in applying TDS limits: Global Advanced Metals Industrial Wastewater Treatment Facility on Swamp Creek in the Schuylkill, the major tributary to the Delaware. They allowed 15,000 milligrams per liter of TDS. And also another example is JBS Souderton Industrial Wastewater Treatment Facility. It's a meatpacking plant, also on the Schuylkill River in Skippack Creek. They allowed a TDS of 3,100 milligrams per liter. These were huge violations, but they were variances, so they're quote-unquote legal. So even when it is known that a discharger could not possibly meet required standards through the year because of high pollution levels in the wastewater they want to put in, DRBC has currently bent the rules by allowing open lagoons to temporarily store wastewater, like, for instance, at certain times when it can't be discharged, like low flow, and then let them put it in later. So they really bend over backwards. So not only are the regulations not strict enough, but the DRBC already goes around the rules and allows for pollution by TDS, and we have more examples of this as well. Sorry to say, but DRBC simply can't be relied on to stick to what's in the rules. And those are facts on the record. Also, monitoring and reporting of numeric effluent limits, it's not a requirement. It's only may be required. How are they going to keep on top of this? The DRBC doesn't even have enforcement police. I want to mention what we talked about last week about the supersized frack wells. If you remember, the supersized wells that they're building now have horizontal well bores up to 4 miles long. And as we discussed last week, these use between 10 and 20 million gallons of water per well now, not the 4 and 5 million gallons of water that each well frac used to use. So this not only means more water, but it also means there's going to be greater volumes of wastewater produced by these wells too. So gone are these old estimates of about 10 to 15% of the flow back coming back up from 5 million gallons, hundreds of thousands of gallons of waste. Gone are those days. The new normal is steadily climbing to what usually flows back up 10 to 15% of 10 to 20 million gallons of waste being produced short term, immediately at the frac wells. So we're talking, depending on whether you're talking about 10 or 20 million gallons, between 1 and 3 million gallons of wastewater per fracked well, as opposed to hundreds of thousands of gallons. And that dwarfs the prior volumes and throws out the window that any planning that DRBC was thinking was valid in this proposal to allow wastewater to come here. We're really here in Pennsylvania and everywhere where shale fracking is going on, as this technology advances and they do these longer and longer supersized horizontal well bores, there's a new glut of wastewater that has to go somewhere. The fact is, the need for more places to get rid of this wastewater is a problem. It's already a problem before these new horizontal well bores were lengthened. So it's becoming so acute that we really think the industry is targeting the Delaware River Basin for this reason and because they need the water, and this is no accident. With these draft regulations, the DRBC is opening the door for that. The Delaware River watershed's proximity to one of the most productive regions of the Marcellus shale play and northeastern portion of Susquehanna watershed, it really makes us very attractive. Now quickly, just to finish this up, we don't know what's going to happen in terms of injection wells. We don't know if the DRBC will allow these. They don't disallow it. They don't prohibit it. What does storage mean? They're going to allow giant storage basins of wastewater, lagoons. Is wastewater going to be spread on roadways and land applied, supposedly, clean to certain standards? All of this is very unclear. Also, just quickly like to say they don't mention temperature anywhere in the proposed regulations, and that's a crucial water quality parameter that can, especially when you combine it with certain contaminants such as TDS, be damaging to habitat and actually deadly for species. So at this point, we want to look at some specific examples of what are the challenges and the problems that we know of with current frac wastewater disposal. And to do that, I'm going to turn this over to Wes Gillingham from Catskill Mountainkeeper, and then after that, Justy Horowitz is going to be coming on for the Partnership for Policy Integrity, and they're going to walk you through a couple of really good examples looking at the details. Wes?
Hello, this is Wes Gillingham, Associate Director at Catskill Mountainkeeper.
Hello? Dusty Horwitz from Partnership for Policy Integrity. I can't hear Wes, though.
Wes, can we hear you? Okay, I think we lost Wes, and he'll jump back in. Dusty, since you're on, why don't we move down to your slide? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, so Dusty Horwitz, he's, as I mentioned in the beginning, he's the senior counsel for the Partnership for Policy Integrity. They're based in Washington, D.C., and he's going to give us a couple of examples of what he's been finding in studies that they've been doing regarding fracking and frack wastewater. Go ahead, Dusty, and then Wes will catch up when he gets back on.
Thanks, Tracy. Should I move the slide down?
Yes, move it on down.
Okay. All right. So a few years ago, we found out that for decades, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has been reviewing and regulating new chemicals proposed for use in drilling of oil and gas wells and fracking of oil and gas wells under the New Chemicals Program that was created by the Toxic Substances Control Act. So we filed a Freedom of Information request with EPA asking for their reviews of these chemicals. And what we found was extremely troubling. We released a report last year on this called Toxic Secrets. It's available on our website, and the radio program Marketplace on NPR recently did a two-part segment on our investigation, which you can find on their website. What we found was that between 2009 and 2014, EPA reviewed 105 new chemicals proposed for drilling and fracking for health and environmental risks under their New Chemicals Program. EPA had health concerns about most of these chemicals, 88 of the 105, ranging from irritation to skin, eyes, and mucous membranes, lung effects, neurotoxicity, kidney toxicity, and developmental toxicity. Despite these concerns, EPA allowed almost all of these chemicals to go into commercial production, 98 out of the 105, often without health testing data that could have more conclusively determined the health risks of these chemicals. And of those chemicals, of the 105, more than half actually did go into commercial production and use. In other words, if EPA allows a chemical to go into production, there's no guarantee that it will. That's the manufacturer's decision. And in more than half the cases, the manufacturers did put the chemicals into commercial production. The chemical manufacturers frequently withheld as trade secrets information about the chemicals' identities, all sorts of identifiers for the chemicals that might allow people to find out where they're being used. And this confidentiality makes it very difficult to know the locations where these chemicals are being injected into oil and gas wells. If there is drilling and fracking allowed in the Delaware River Basin, it's likely, based on our investigation and other publications that EPA has released, that drilling companies will be using secret chemicals and potentially dangerous chemicals. These chemicals could contaminate water supplies through a variety of routes: leaks, spills, underground migration, introduction through wastewater. And the water supplies could be contaminated even if fracking is banned but wastewater treatment is allowed, as we've been discussing. EPA has established that fracking wastewater can contain chemicals injected in the fracking process, and so therefore if you have fracking wastewater coming into the basin for treatment, it's likely that the treatment facilities will be treating unknown and potentially dangerous contaminants. So if the facilities don't know what they're trying to remove from the water, they're unlikely to be able to remove it, and they could discharge contaminated wastewater into waterways. So because of this extensive use of secret and potentially dangerous chemicals, for which the EPA itself has identified health concerns, that's a good reason to prohibit all types of drilling activities in the basin, drilling, fracking, and wastewater treatment among them.
Thank you, Dusty. Now we're going to go back to Wes and his slide, which is mistake on the Monongahela. And Wes, if you can unmute yourself, thank you.
Yep. Sorry about that glitch. The mistake on the Monongahela is a much bigger mistake than the spelling on the title. It's spelled correctly in the text. But all of what Dusty just mentioned really speaks to things that have already happened on different levels. This isn't thinking about the future possibilities, but it's actually these mistakes have been made and information has been kept from the public. What happened on the Monongahela back in the beginning, just as the wells were, the build-out was really happening, bromide concentrations increased on the Monongahela River. All the public waste treatment facilities were taking allowable limits under the law and under the regulations for each specific facility. But what they didn't calculate is what would happen if up and down the valley, all of those facilities were taking waste. And what happened is it caused a real spike in bromide levels, which is a salt that comes back up from the formation. And these salts, when they mix with chlorine and other public water supply disinfectants, they cause something called trihalomethane and haloacetic acid. Trihalomethane is a very scary chemical to have near a public drinking water supply. It's a very high carcinogen, even at low concentrations. And what happened back then, the bromide levels in the Monongahela rose all the way up to scary levels, and it caused the state to ask the industry to stop bringing it to the waste treatment facilities. And at the bottom of the slide, you see two headlines. Bromide levels in the Monongahela rose in 2010 remain high. That was in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in 2011. And then another headline, bromide pollution persists in the Allegheny River in western Pennsylvania. The same thing happened in the Allegheny Valley. And there's been some really good studies. Tomorrow, when this webinar gets posted, and there will be a bunch of links to some of the studies. One of the reasons I picked the bromide issue is because it's a really easy one to look up. If you're wanting to do comments at a hearing, or if you're working on written comments later, it's really easy to find tons of newspaper articles about this and some really good studies by universities on the issue. So don't just take this slide, but really get on the internet and look at the issue of bromides. There's a lot of good information, and it's pretty scary to have a trihalomethane in your drinking water, which is actually a chemical they use to induce cancer lesions in lab animals for cancer study. So another thing that happened with a particular chemical, which is kind of scary as this unfolded around the same time. So the title of the next slide is, where did the carcinogen come from and how did it disappear? What we're talking about throughout this whole presentation is the fact that the regulators and the agencies are not really equipped to deal with the volumes of waste and successfully protect us from the chemicals in the flowback water that's going to waste, that would potentially go to waste treatment facilities. Again, back when New York State was looking at coming up with new regulations for drilling in New York, the draft supplemental generic environmental impact statement showed us that the disposal of flowback water at the public operated treatment works creates a substantial risk of contaminating surface waters with toxic chemicals that go undetected by multiple different screening processes. So in 2009, at a hearing, at the environmental conservation hearing in New York, after they published a documentation of samples they took in Pennsylvania, they showed 4-nitroquinolone oxide was documented in 24 of the 24 samples in the flowback water. Now, this is another highly carcinogenic chemical. And at the hearing, it was questioned by, there were some chemical experts there, and people It got a lot of news at the time, and then miraculously, a month later, the consulting firm that was hired by the DEC went back and said that there was not any nitrochlorine oxide in the flowback water, and that it was a typo. And I think that's the kind of thing that Dusty is talking about, is really having the agencies who end up relying on private consulting firms that work with industry all the time. And it's really hard to trust this process of what chemicals we're talking about. So, was that really a typographical error? Chapter 5 of the 2001 revised draft Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement explained that the New York State Department of Health reviewed information on 322 unique chemicals that were present in 235 products. And as you read on, and we've already covered this to a certain extent in terms of the volumes of chemicals, and that's old information. There's a lot more that they're using. This really speaks to the whole idea of allowing wastewater in the river valley. It's a huge mistake, and they don't have the capacity to deal with it. So that brings us back to another component of flowback water.
Okay, so thank you very much, Wes. We just have one more slide that we're going to use as an example of why it is so difficult and dangerous to handle the pollutants that are in frac wastewater. And this example is technically enhanced naturally occurring radioactive material, or TENNORM for short. The Marcellus Formation contains radionuclides. We've known that for years. It's radioactive. USGS, EPA, everybody knows that. And uranium-238, thorium-232, and their decay products, which include what we've heard quite a bit about, radium-226, for instance, and radon, radium-228, are all down in that Marcellus Formation. When it's locked away, a mile beneath our feet, it doesn't hurt us. But when it's brought up as a result of fracking to the surface, it's a health hazard. Fracking concentrates radioactivity in the waste. As the material that is so-called recycled, the flowback that comes back up in one well, is used again in another well, that material becomes concentrated, and the radionuclides concentrate and become even more highly toxic than the naturally occurring radioactive material that existed before it was concentrated. And radium-226, it's a problem. I mean, it has a half-life of 1,600 years. That means it's going to be here for thousands of years, many future generations. And also, it can cause lymphoma, bone cancer, leukemia, plastic anemia. Do we need more cancer? Radon is the #2 cause of lung cancer in the U.S. So radium is water soluble. That means it really easily travels with water and wastewater. So it'll get into the wastewater. Also, radionuclides can be trapped in the drill cuttings, and the residual solids that is the material, as we talked about earlier, that's left basically on the filter after the wastewater goes through. And that provides another pathway for the release to the environment. It increases human exposure, and it increases its presence in the environment and enduring legacy of contamination. Now, New York, when they did the SGEIS that Wes was talking about, when they did their sampling, they found radium-226 in rock cuttings over 200 times the background concentrations, or what's called the natural concentrations of that material. That's highly, highly concentrated. And Duke University, for instance, did another study. They found radium-226 at 200 times or greater than 200 times in sediments downstream from a wastewater treatment plant that was accepting frac wastewater in Pennsylvania. And those sediments were 200 times greater than the samples that were taken upstream. And it far, far exceeded disposal regulations and health standards. Frack wastewater containing TEM norm is not properly regulated. It simply is not regulated by the federal government adequately, nor by the states. They don't require, for instance, testing at key junctures. The wells, when the waste comes up, are not required to test for the naturally occurring radioactive materials before it's put in the truck or the pipeline and taken away for disposal. The trucks that carry that waste are not placarded or don't have signs on them that accurately reflect the level of radioactivity, risking exposure if there should be an accident along the way. Also, allowing that material that's highly toxic and radioactive to be handled and spilled and kept in open pits before it actually does either get injected down an injection well or disposed of in a wastewater treatment facility. And another problem that we have, and we have some scientific studies on this, and one of them is in the talking points, is it's really difficult to accurately measure and monitor radioactive materials. It's not even well understood among regulators about how to do this. And lots of times the wrong tests are applied. People think they're protected and they're not. How are they going to manage this at treatment plants? So we have a very big problem with one of the most toxic materials known to the human race, and that's naturally occurring radioactive materials. We have them being technically enhanced, and then we're leaving them basically in the environment. They don't go away. It's not like you're going to filter it out and all of a sudden it's gone. You filter it out, some of it stays in the wastewater stream itself, and then the rest of it is in the residuals that really, according to Dr. Marvin Resnikoff, and we use some of his studies in the talking points document that accompanies the webinar, and he says that most of this material needs to be taken to a similar facility, such as a nuclear waste facility. It's that highly concentrated and dangerous. So, at this point, we'd like to open it up to questions and answers, and we'd like you to, ask away of Dusty, Wes, and myself any questions you have about the wastewater in order to get a little better handle on the issue, and also to talk about what maybe you want to say at the hearing, and is this valid? You can also chat with us by email afterwards. The addresses are all on the websites listed here on the last slide. Dusty at the Partnership for Policy and Integrity, Wes at Catskill Mountainkeeper, myself at Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and Karen, even though she's not on tonight, has a lot of expertise in wastewater, and she's available too at her website. But right now, there's some questions already up. I'm going to kick off the first one. Somebody was asking, are there treatment plants that are in operation that are actually filtering these toxins out, or is this just sort of a fantasy? Well, it's a good question. Most of the waste that's produced by fracked wells is injected into injection wells for storage. And that's really pretty much about 95% or even higher of all the frack wastewater goes to injection wells. And that's because it's very difficult to treat these materials. There really isn't a system design that totally removes all of the pollutants in that waste stream. And of course, injection wells are a problem on their own. They leak and they cause earthquakes, and they're not a reliable way to store frack wastewater either. It's not a disposal method, it's simply a storage method, and you're removing a problem from one place in time to just another place in time. They're already causing problems, and we have a scientific paper that's linked in the documents talking about injection wells and the problems that they're causing. One particular problem downstream of an injection well in West Virginia. But it doesn't mean that they're not going to do it. As a matter of fact, they're building a new industrial wastewater treatment plant, or they want to build one in Pennsylvania right now. There are grandfathered industrial wastewater treatment plants in Pennsylvania that are operating that allow a lot of the pollutants to pass through them. They should have been shut down years ago, but Pennsylvania, unfortunately, as we have discussed on these other webinars, is a victim of the industry or a partner with the industry, if you want to look at it that way, and pretty much has been influenced so gravely that the regulations that are in place do not have the teeth they need in order to protect Pennsylvania and the people that live there from the pollution from fracking. But they can build these things, and DRBC with these regulations, maybe they wouldn't put a giant industrial wastewater treatment facility in the non-tidal portion of the Delaware. Maybe they'd put some small ones, though, up there, some of these on-site facilities that don't discharge to water. They use them at well sites right now. Maybe they do something like that. Maybe they put storage ponds up there. We don't know exactly what they would think up in order, the industry is desperate, remember, to get rid of this stuff. But downstream in the estuary, with all the loopholes they've built into these regulations, with the lax way that the DRBC is currently enforcing some of the stopping points that should keep wastewater out of waterways, such as the high salts in the TDS, such as the radioactivity and the bromides that cause the cancer-causing trihalomethanes, those that really should stop wastewater from being discharged from fracking because you simply cannot bring them to clean water standards. Those actually down in the estuary, you can drive a frack truck through these regulations that DRBC has proposed. And if you give them the leeway to give waivers, which they do now, and they didn't take that away in these proposed regulations, then they'd say they're going to meet it, they'd design something saying that was going to be effective, but they really would not be able to treat these pollutants. But I'd like, Dusty, perhaps, and Wes too, if you could add, but Dusty, we don't even know what's in this stuff anyway, right?
No, we don't. And, as I mentioned, you can't really know where these chemicals have been used, even when we have records showing that EPA has specific health concerns about them, neurotoxicity, kidney toxicity. I neglected to say that we tried to find 41 of the chemicals that EPA reviewed had health concerns about and that were likely used or used in oil and gas wells by looking at the two leading fracking chemical disclosure databases. The state of California has one, and then Frack Focus, which includes fracking chemical disclosures for the state of Pennsylvania. And we could locate oil and gas wells where only 2 of these 41 chemicals have been used. So you can't know exactly what's being used in a particular well, and if waste starts being imported into the Delaware River Basin for treatment or some other type of disposal like underground injection, odds are that no one possibly is going to know what's in it.
Right. And Wes, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, well, when you were going through the regulations that they proposed, it talked about setting levels of toxicity at the treatment facility. But as we see from the bromide issue, the trihalomethanes are formed from chemical combination, and that wouldn't be happening necessarily right where you're releasing it. It happens where the water gets treated in the drinking water supply. And if we don't know what some of the other chemicals are coming in, that same kind of chemical combination and new mixtures of chemicals can happen without even knowing the capacity for dangerous chemicals to be formed in your water supply. And that's the scariest part about releasing this stuff into a water course that is used for drinking water.
Great, thanks. I see there's another question here. What about us out here in the western part of the state where fracking is going on? How can we motivate our communities to take part in the important things that we're talking about? It's really a terrible situation where communities and the environment are being ruined by fracking in Pennsylvania. And we really have to stop it. And I know that seems pie in the sky, but we believe that we must get a stop to fracking throughout the entire state of Pennsylvania. That's one of the reasons we want to make sure we get a ban here, and so we can show that if you doing the right thing means not allowing this to go forward. And certainly, if we were to allow water to be taken from here to fuel fracking outside of our watershed, or if we were to allow wastewater that they're dying to get rid of to come in here, we'd be facilitating fracking outside of our watershed, and that is unethical. We do not support that, and that's one of the reasons that we don't want to be used in that way, besides the fact we don't want our own watershed ruined. So I would say, that the weak points here that especially are emerging as a result of these supersized wells and these very long well bores is the ravenous need for more water and the urgent situation that's being created by all of this frack wastewater coming back up in huge volumes. Stop the water and stop the frack wastewater. And I know people are fighting that new industrial wastewater treatment plant they want to put out there. They also want to put an injection well in Pennsylvania. Years back, they always said, we don't have the right geology for that. Well, apparently, somebody thinks they do. And we think they're making it up as they go along, frankly. There's no particular right geology. They all crack, they all leak, and there's no way for these wells these injection wells to ever be safe. But stopping the ways that they can get rid of the waste and stopping their source of water are two of the weak points that the industry has. That's why they're now, running over to the watershed here. That's why they're wanting to, build more injection wells. It doesn't get rid of the waste. It just gets it out of their face. Anyone want to add anything to that about, how to kind of inspire others or to others who are already facing this terrible fracking impacts throughout Pennsylvania?
Well, I mean, just the process of doing comments and getting it in the public record can be used in other places. So as you hear, we were referencing New York regulatory process, and that's been very helpful thinking about what the DRBC can do and ban and change the regs. The information here ends up in the public record and the comments, and then the research that people are doing can be cycled and used in other river basins.
That's a really good point, and it's one of the reasons that we really want to create the most substantial record about why fracking must be stopped and why wastewater from fracking and water for fracking must be stopped. It's going to create a great record that can be used everywhere. To point out that our talking points are really rich in references, and you can click on one of those references and you'll come up with a whole book or the PSE Healthy Energy site, which has I think it's up almost 1,000 scientific papers now. They looked at about almost 700 of them and found almost all, the majority of those papers on fracking showed that it had negative effects on the environment and human health. That is a fantastic website for information. That's in the talking points. So there's a lot of places where you can go, references or citations or hot links in these talking points that will give you treasure trove to develop your comments. And, we're really looking forward to the hearings next week, Tuesday in Waymart and Thursday in Philadelphia, so people can speak their mind and have their 2 or 3 minutes before the commission. We also were to the weeks ahead, up to March 30th, when written comments of substance can be put on the record to prove that you can't do fracking safely and you simply can't allow frack wastewater to be dumped into any waterway, and you can't allow water to be wasted, as we discussed last week, for fracking. I see here there's a question about the DRBC. Do they have any authority to regulate or prohibit injection wells, or is it only federal law? And that does fall under EPA. However, the Delaware River Basin Commission is an agency that was formed by statute and a compact and a Supreme Court decree, and they're very powerful. And they arguably have equal or greater power than the EPA, and they can establish laws and regulations as long as they base them on how it affects the management of the water resources of the watershed. So we believe they do have a power. Now, the strict legal question on that, I'm not a lawyer, but we will be submitting on the record extensive legal comments and also extensive technical comments, and those legal comments will delve into issues such as this. So Bernie asked that question, and we believe they do have that power. When we submit our comments, we'll have some more legal backing to that. Also would like to point out that Delaware Riverkeeper Network and many of the more than 20 organizations that are at the core of our campaign to ban fracking in the Delaware River watershed, working now since the beginning of this year and now through this public comment, beginning of last year, and now through this public comment period to ban fracking in the watershed. Many of us are engaging experts or are doing technical analyses to put this information about fracking on the DRBC record. So we have here at Delaware Riverkeeper Network 5 or 6 experts that will be delving into all of these issues that we've touched on in our webinars and in our talking points in much more depth, and we'll be sharing those comments when we submit them. So there's a lot more here that will be developed. We're just trying to touch on the things that people may want to address in their 2 or 3 minutes before the Delaware River Basin Commission hearings next week and in February and March 6th, and then also in your written comments that you could submit. You can submit a written comment, by the way, every day to the DRBC. You don't only have one chance to do it, and the record's open right now through March 30th. Okay, so do we have any other questions? We're at 7:36, and we do try to honor everybody's time and keep it, to not too much over an hour. But is there anything that people are just burning to say or ask that they put in the chat box that maybe we missed? Or what do you think, Wes and Dusty, anything you want to add here before we close out?
I guess I would say, piggybacking on what Wes mentioned earlier, that not only would creating a record be great for folks in western Pennsylvania, but if the Commission were to make a decision prohibiting all or most oil and gas activity in the basin, that decision would also be something that would be very powerful to use in the western part of the state, as the decision in New York has been very powerful for people everywhere, whether in the Delaware River Basin or in the state of Maryland that banned fracking after New York made that move before Maryland.
Thank you, Dusty. Wes, do you have anything you want to say before we close out?
I just want to thank everybody for coming on to listen to this, and it gives me hope that these hearings will get people out and make those comments, and that's what makes the difference. They need to see bodies at the hearings and piles of comments, written comments at the end of this process.
That's right. Thank you. So, yeah, get involved. Go to the hearings. If you haven't signed up, you can still do so online. Perhaps Matt from Delaware Riverkeeper can type into the chat box the Facebook event link to the hearings, and you can go there and sign up still. There's a link that if you don't, that you can use online. If you don't sign up online and you go to the hearing, you may not be able to get in if all the seats are taken. So please do that ahead of time. There's still room in every single hearing. Maybe not room to speak, but room to attend. We're going to have, before each of the hearings, the one in Waymart in the afternoon and in Philly in the afternoon, a press conference and a little rally type event. So join us in Philadelphia. The campaign will be there at 11:30 for a press conference in Philadelphia at the airport, the Doubletree Hilton, where the hearing is going to be. Those locations, again, are at the Facebook page and on the DRBC's website, drbc.net. And then in Waymart, we're at 11:45. We're having a press conference at the camp where the hearing is being held in Wayne County. Please join us there. Bring your signs, bring your banners to all of these. We'll set them up outside. Can't take them inside, but we'll have a good visual presence and rally ourselves before we go in to speak our mind. I want to say, just in closing, that we believe we are going to achieve a complete and permanent ban on gas drilling, on fracking, and all the related activities, including frack wastewater and frack water. We believe we're going to achieve that throughout the Delaware River watershed. And we're going to achieve it because of you, because of all of us and the communities here and those beyond that appreciate the Delaware River and love it like we do. So come out, rally with us, join with us, take part in the written comment, fill those templates at the DRBC with your comments about this, and let's get this done. Let's ban fracking in the Delaware River watershed and then take it beyond. Thank you all for joining us tonight.